All right. Can everyone hear me? Good. All right. So I guess we've hit 7 o'clock. So
Do you want it louder or softer?
Time to get started.
Loud. No, I'm good.
So all right. So I guess if I unless someone starts waving at me, no, I guess we'll go ahead and get going here. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the One Book, One Sioux County virtual author visit with SM Hulse, who I'm sure you all know as she is the author of our 2020 One Book, One Sioux County book, Black River. And so my name is Matt Hohammer. I'm the director at the Whole Public Library that's here in Sioux County. And I get to be one of your moderators tonight for the event. I know that I speak for all of us that are a part of the One Book, One Sioux County program when I say that we're very happy that you're all here tonight and that we are very, very excited that Sarah was able to join us as well for our event. While we were disappointed that current events forced us to go virtual instead of in person like we've done in the past, we are very excited that we were still able to have this event and that it went forward tonight. I don't know if all of you know this, but this is our 5th year of our One Book, One Sioux County collaboration. And so, yeah, I think it's pretty exciting that we've made it 5 years. And I think I'm speaking for all of us when I say that I think we picked a pretty great book for this year's selection. So yeah, just to kind of do a little housekeeping first, I'll just kind of lay out what the evening's going to look like, and then we'll jump right in. And so after you guys get to listen to me talk for a few minutes, just with this kind of stuff, we'll jump right into the main event, the interview with Sarah. If any of you have any questions that you would like to ask, put them in the chat box. We have one of our committee members, Greta, will be monitoring that chat, and then after the interview process, we will have an audience Q&A that she'll moderate. Once we get past the audience Q&A, we will announce next year's book. We've got that confirmed and decided, and so yeah, have a big reveal for that. And then finally, we've got several books that we just love to give away to all of you, and so we're gonna have a book prize drawing. I think we've got kind of like a little Wheel of Fortune style app, I guess, that'll pop up and show who wins. So should be kind of exciting, and so yeah, get to do that, and then after that, I think we'll wrap the evening up. So yeah, with all that said, I'm very happy to introduce our guest of honor, who is the author of this year's the 2020 One Book, One Sioux County book selection, Sarah Hulse. Black River was Sarah's debut novel. It received a lot of recognition. It was a Amazon Best Book of the Month and ALA Notable Book. It was an ABA Indies Introduces title, and it won the Reading the West Book Award. So yeah, among other things. And so Sarah received her MFA from the University of Oregon and was a fiction fellow at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She also just recently published, just this past February, her book Eat in Mind. So keep that in mind as a book to check out if you haven't yet. And so, yeah, since I am pretty sure that you're probably tired of hearing me speak, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah for some opening remarks, and then we will jump into our main event. So again, thank you all for coming, and Sarah, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. I just wanted to say thanks for reading Black River. I'm so honored that it was chosen to be a One Book, One Sioux County selection. I too wish I could be there in person. I'm sorry I can't be in your community in person, but I'm really glad we're able to do this virtual event. I'm really excited about it. I want to thank everyone who was involved in organizing it and turning it into a virtual event so that we can all be here tonight. I'm really looking forward to our conversation, and I'm really looking forward to answering your questions later this evening.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you. Yeah, I tried to think of a really, really spectacular transition and came up flat. So I'll just jump right into the questions here. I know one of the first question I thought that we could start with, I'm sure, is one you've heard before, but it seems to be one that everyone is just always really eager to know. And just what was the inspiration behind your writing of Black River?
This is one of those questions that I think I get asked probably at every event and every interview. And it's still sort of a difficult one for me to answer, actually. It's hard for me to pinpoint exactly sort of where the idea or the inspiration for the book came from. But one thing I always think about is when I lived in Montana, I remember traveling through the state and I went through Deer Lodge, Montana, which is where the real state penitentiary is. And I just remember being so struck by the image of this tiny little piece of land being kind of, fenced off, walled off with the razor wire and all of that against the backdrop of this just, picturesque, sprawling Western landscape. So I think that image and the strangeness of it really stuck with me. On a more sort of thematic level, I knew I really wanted to write a book about characters who, even if they were very deeply flawed, were for the most part trying to do what they thought was right, but were in conflict with one another anyway. That dynamic of different people trying to do what they believe to be the right thing and having clashes as a result was pretty compelling to me. So those might be the first things I can put my finger on as inspirations for the novel.
Okay. Awesome. Well, no, kind of hearing that a little bit about the inspiration. Would you be willing to tell us a little bit about your writing process and how you go about crafting your novels, or even Black River specifically?
Definitely. Yeah, I'll start and tell you a little bit about how Black River came to be specifically, and then I'll talk a little bit about my writing process more generally. So Black River was actually my graduate school thesis. When as you mentioned in your intro, I went to the University of Oregon for my MFA. And I was mostly writing short stories for the workshops or the classes, but I knew going into the program that I wanted to write this novel. So I made that my thesis. I kind of did it on the side outside of class for the most part. And by the time I graduated, I had a draft. It was a pretty solid draft, but there was a lot wrong with it. For one thing, it was way too long. It was about 400 pages in manuscript form, which was about 125,000 words. The ending was atrocious, which seems to be, for the record, a thing I do. I write atrocious endings before I hopefully write much better ones later. And I was very fortunate because after I graduated, I got a postgraduate fellowship at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And we taught a couple classes at the university, but the rest of the time, the idea was that you would finish your first book. So I spent a lot of time trying to just spend a few months cutting. I cut 25,000 words out of the book. Sorry, my backdrop is moving because the author's cat is joining us for the evening. So I cut about 25,000 words out of the book. I cleaned up some things. I found some things that maybe didn't really belong in the story, even if they were interesting to me. And about halfway through that year, I signed with my agent. And one of the first things he said to me during a conversation was, something like, wow, I'm really excited about this project, but I think you should cut 20,000 words. He didn't know I'd just cut 25,000. So I said something like, oh, okay, and hung up the phone and thought very unkind thoughts about him. But it turned out he was right. I did work on it a few more months. I did some more revision. I made those cuts. And we sent it out toward the end of that year, about a year after I graduated from my MFA, sent it out to publishers, and we sold it within 2 weeks. So did a little more editing with my editor at my publishing house after that. But that's kind of how Black River went from being sort of a grad school project to the book you actually have. And my writing process in general is you know, I'm a planner. I really do a lot of thinking before I write something. Sometimes I say this is part of why I'm a novelist, is the return on investment of time for short stories is like not great for me. I spend like 6 months thinking about it, then write it in like a weekend and revise it over a couple of weeks. It's not the best use of my writing time for me personally. So I do that with my novels too. I do a lot of research, make a lot of notes. I think a lot about like narrative structure. You know, write the first draft. I tend to write chronologically. I try and just get one out there so I have something to work with. And I do a lot of revision. I'm definitely an author who spends a lot of time revising. My second book, Eden Mine, that you mentioned, I have 30 manuscript boxes in my apartment right now of different drafts of that book. And it was pretty similar for Black River. I once took a picture of all my manuscripts and drafts of Black River next to a copy of the not very thick paperback. And I said something like, this is what a book looks like to its author versus to the readers. So I do a lot of that, but it's something I really enjoy. I've had the same editor for both of my books. I've enjoyed working with her, but it's a process. And by the time I'm done with one, I'm pretty done with it.
Oh, so, all right, awesome. Yeah, it's always interesting to kind of hear. At least I think in the past, especially the past few years, always interesting to hear the writing process and how each author is unique in writing their works. And so yeah, one question next I thought we could ask was just if you drew any inspiration from your own life for your novels, or you mentioned your short stories even as well. Or are they something that springs entirely from your imagination?
You know, I don't have a lot of interest in like autobiographical fiction as an author for myself. So it is mostly, you know, imagination. I really enjoy doing research. You know, one of the things I love about writing novels is that it's like a wonderful excuse to spend a few years kind of immersing myself in something that's always interested me, but that I maybe didn't know all that much about. You know, with Black River, one of those things was definitely kind of the old time and bluegrass music. And you know, I just love imagining other people's lives. I mean, one of the things as a fiction writer and as a reader, I love the promise of fiction. You know, I love the idea that as humans, we can put ourselves in someone else's shoes. We can imagine what it's like to live the life of someone very different than ourselves. So I think I love that part of being a fiction writer. Now, you know, certainly things, you know, I draw on things from my own life, but generally not directly. You know, I might think of an experience of grief in my own life and apply that to like Wes's experience after his wife has died, for example. And sometimes small details will come in. One of the ones in Black River is that Dennis's horse Rio has one eye that has sort of the white rim around it. And it says it gives him a very like human gaze. My horse had that as well. So that was my little nod to my horse in the book. But he was very different. In the book, you know, Rio's a quarter horse. He's used for Western riding. My horse was a thoroughbred X-race horse that I like rode dressage with. So it tends not to map very closely, but there will be some of those bits and pieces that make their way in for sure.
All right. Okay, awesome. You kind of mentioned this just a little in your previous answer, but one of the questions I've heard a lot, and I think we've all kind of heard a lot, was with music being such an important part of Black River, we've kind of gotten people asking, and so I think people are kind of curious if you have a musical background at all.
My answer to that is kind of. So I played viola, classical viola, as a kid, and I was not good. If you are a musician, you're probably familiar with viola jokes. My personal favorite is, what do a violist's fingers and lightning have in common? They never strike the same place twice. That was pretty much me. So that, you know, I kind of lived up or down to those jokes, as the case may be. but I always loved music as a listener. I really kind of admired and was maybe even jealous of people who were really good at it. When I started writing Black River, like I said, I actually didn't know all that much about old time and bluegrass, except that, I liked what I'd heard of it and I wanted to know more. And when it came time to kind of pick Wes's instrument, I said, well, fiddle makes sense because even if I played a string instrument, in decidedly mediocre fashion, I at least kind of know how it works. And, as I was working, I was thinking, well, I should really interview somebody who actually, knows a lot about playing the fiddle. And somehow that very quickly morphed into, or I could buy a fiddle and take lessons. So that's what I did. I actually learned to play the fiddle while I was writing Black River. And it was great. The way I learned was very much kind of what I portrayed in the book when Wes is teaching. It was all by ear. It was kind of just learning from someone who would play the tune until I could play it too. And that really worked for me. I'm a much better fiddler than I was a violist. I'm not great though. I am not Wes. I say my level of proficiency is such that my cat no longer flees the room, like when I get the fiddle case out, in case that's a gauge. And yet it was a lot of fun to write about, and it was very powerful to write about, because I think even though Wes is much, much, much more gifted than I will ever be at music, I think what Wes feels for music is something like what I feel for writing. And so I've become really interested as a writer in writing about other forms of creative expression. In my newer book, I write about visual art. And of course, Black River is very much about the music. The music is so important. So it's definitely one of those things where I like writing about it. I wish I were as good as my characters. I enjoy it. I think the fiddle will probably always be a hobby for me, but I will never be putting out an album and asking people to pay money for it. That's for sure.
Okay, so yeah, kind of interesting when the book was such a central part of it. I know people were kind of curious. If it was because of your background or just something that had appealed to you when writing. And so, so another part of the book that I know was discussed in quite a few of our book clubs around the county. I think I actually probably stole this from one of those book clubs. So it's the question was, faith and religion plays such an important role in Black River's story. It's kind of a two-part question. One was, what drew you to making this such an important theme in your work? And then in the novel, you stated that the fiddle talked to Wes. And then I think people were wondering if, was that fiddle a symbol of Wes's faith?
Yeah, just in terms of, why did I choose to make kind of faith and religion an important part of my writing? I mean, it's an important part of my life. So it's I think, natural for me to want to write about it. I also kind of feel that in contemporary literary fiction, religion, especially Christianity and especially Protestant Christianity, is not very present in a lot of the books that are being published now. When it is present, I think it's often kind of in satirical form, or maybe it's exaggerated. Or it's just absent in a lot of work. And that kind of strikes me as interesting because, in the United States, certainly faith and religion are very important to a lot of people, more so than in many other Western countries. So kind of the deficiency I see there in a lot of fiction is really interesting to me. And it's something I did want to make sure I actually engaged with in my work. One of the comments I liked best in all the reviews I got of Black River was in the Washington Post review. The critic Ron Charles said something like, Hulse is one of the few authors working today who's able to portray religion as it actually is in Americans' daily lives, or something. That's a paraphrase. But I remember reading that and just being like, good, yes, that's a thing I wanted to do. And in Black River, it is important to Wes. It's important to some of the other characters, not all of them. And just seeing that as something that was a part of his life, and that he wanted to be a part of his life even when he was struggling with it, did feel important to me. I like the opportunities that fiction creates to kind of explore these issues. I'm very interested in sort of what is Christian fiction, if you will. Is it anything written by a Christian author? Is it the stuff that you find in that particular section of Walmart. I buy stuff from that section of Walmart, so I don't mean that in a judgy way. But it's an interesting question. And so I like the idea as an author for myself of writing books for a general audience that do engage seriously with these questions. As for the fiddle, for myself, I don't know if I would phrase it as a symbol, but it's definitely a key part, I think, of how Wes relates to his faith and to God. To me, when I wrote that, we see Wes really struggle with faith throughout the novel. And as the book kind of progresses, I think we start to understand that what Williams did to Wes during the prison riot, didn't just inflict pain upon him, and it didn't just take away a hobby that was important to him. There's a conversation late in the book that Wes has with his neighbor farmer where they really talk about this outright. And I think it becomes very clear that for Wes, his music was sort of a thing that let him believe there were other things out there that maybe God did exist and cared about him. And so that was, definitely something I was working with throughout that. For myself, I've always found kind of, from the theology, the idea of art and beauty as sort of evidence for God, kind of an interesting idea. And I think it was something I wanted to explore in this book. And it does also kind of heighten, I think, at the end of the book when Wes has to make some very difficult choices. He has to engage with that question of faith and forgiveness without the primary means through which he has explored those ideas elsewhere in his life.
Okay. So well, thank you. Yeah, that was very, very good. Very informative on that. So kind of, you just mentioned kind of towards the end of the story, do you have any plans or have you ever considered revisiting the story or any of the characters introduced in Black River?
Probably not. I mentioned earlier, when I'm kind of done with the book, I feel done with it. But this is actually kind of an interesting thing. Until this week, the last time I read through Black River was when I read the final page proofs before it was published, which I think was, I think I read those in March of 2014, and it was published almost a year later. And so that's right, One Book, One Sioux County finally got me to read one of my own books in book form after publication. I've never done that before. That's how done I am with them. But, and it was really interesting. It was an interesting experience. I wanted to make sure I was prepared for this event. But it also kind of made me feel like, I'm done with this story. However, my second book, Eden Mine, it sort of shares a fictional geography with Black River. It's in a different fictional town, but the city Elk Fork is in both novels. And I definitely, am interested in a lot of the same themes, I think, in my writing. I think that people who liked Black River would probably like a lot of my other writing because I do kind of revisit some of the same ideas from, I hope, different and interesting angles. But I don't think I'll probably ever do something with the same characters. It's something I've thought about. I talked earlier about I made all these cuts from Black River, and one of the things that I cut a lot of, there's a character, Lane Gregory, who was in this band with Wes and Farmer. And he's not in the present storyline of the book. He had died before the book began. But in the original draft, there was a lot about this guy. I found him very interesting. I thought a lot of those scenes were really interesting, and I liked the character, but it just didn't belong in the novel. It just wasn't, it wasn't his story. So there were times when I thought, oh, maybe someday I'll write something with a peripheral character from one of my other novels. But if I had to say now, I probably won't revisit the same characters from my books and later books.
Okay. So, I hadn't thought about a character that maybe got cut or something. That could be an interesting story. Same setting, people might recognize things and put a different character. So, very, very cool. We've talked a lot about Wes and his role in the story. And so one of the questions I've kind of come across a few times is obviously you're a woman, and obviously Wes in the story is the main character is a man. So did you ever find it difficult to capture either Wes or any other of the male characters' voices authentically, or did that come fairly easy for you?
You know what's interesting is I don't know that I thought all that much about gender while I was writing it. I've thought a lot about it since. I've gotten asked a lot about it, but I didn't sit down when I was writing it thinking, "Ooh, I'm a woman writing about all these men." And I think part of that is because, like I mentioned earlier, I do like writing about characters who are very different than I am. And so in many ways, I think the fact that Wes is a man is just another way in which he is not the same as me. No, I'm not a man, but I'm also not a corrections officer. I'm not a good fiddler. I've never been married. There are, a lot of ways in which I am not like him and like some of my other characters. So some of it is that. I also, for myself as an author, when I write, I definitely don't want my characters to kind of just be, I don't really intend them to be like representative of their identity groups. So, Wes isn't supposed to be like all men or all corrections officers. He's supposed to be Wes Carver. So that was kind of freeing for me, I think. I realized, oh, I don't have to know what it's like as an author to be all men. I don't have to know what it's like to be all 60-year-olds. I don't have to know what it's like to be all COs. I just have to know what it's like to be this one that I'm writing about. And so that's kind of how I approach that kind of thing. And I think that served me pretty well. It's actually interesting, to me, because my newer book, the protagonist is like a 20-something woman. And, I have been 20-something, I am a woman. And yet in many ways, she was harder for me to write than Wes. And I think it's because, she's different from me in other ways. Like Wes, on the surface and all of these identity markers, I don't have a lot in common with him myself, but I can really appreciate, I think, his tendency to sort of like rules, to want other people to follow them, to, kind of want control over his own life. Those are some like personality traits that, while, I hope I'm not as rigid as Wes is, that I can understand and that were not terribly difficult for me to map onto that character. So some of it is certainly that. I have thought more about kind of the gender idea since writing the book and while revising it. One of the things I'm really interested in is kind of the ways in which like the mythologies or stories we tell about the West collide with the realities of the modern West. And I think that could probably also apply to just rural communities and small towns in general too. And gender is certainly a part of that. I'm interested in, to what degree is Wes's idea of who he should be shaped by, all these different forces? How much of it is, this is what a good man does. This is what a good Western man does. This is what I've been told, through stories about cowboys and frontier people that I should be and how I should behave. How much of it is tied to his job? So there's a lot of those kinds of questions I've thought about since. One kind of small thing that's related to this, though, is I have sometimes thought, I publish as SM Hulse, and that's something that my publishers asked me to consider doing shortly before Black River came out. And I know, I think part of why they did that was that the protagonist is male and I am not. And I think they kind of thought the gender neutral name would be good from like a marketing standpoint. But I sometimes wonder if my second book that has the female main character had been my first book, would I have been asked to do that? And I don't know, like I suspect maybe not. So I think, the whole question of people kind of writing across gender is really interesting. And it's something that I think affects even just like the publishing and marketing of the book and maybe the ways in which readers react to it. I've gotten a lot of messages through my website or, reviews online on Amazon or whatever that say things like, "Dear SM Hulse, I had no idea you were a woman. Bye." And that's sort of it. I'm always a little stymied on how to respond to those. I choose to take it as a compliment. You convincingly wrote this character. But the sheer number of those is interesting to me. So having the initials on the book cover, it's just fascinating to see the way we make assumptions about authors kind of based on who they write about. A funny story about Black River is that the Publishers Weekly review that came out before the book was published. They really liked it. It was great, you know, yay, starred review, all this. And yet, even though they had the galley that had like my author photo in it, in which I don't look that much different than this, my author bio has, you know, she did this, she did that. And the review they published used all male pronouns for me. So I think the pull quote we used, if you actually have the paperback of Black River, like somewhere in there where they have all the excerpts from reviews, we had to like take out a his and like put in a bracketed like this instead, because I am not a man. So all of those questions are kind of interesting to me. And, you know, I don't know that I have solid answers for all of them, but it's a fascinating concept, and the ways in which we react to people writing characters who are different from them in some identity way is really interesting to me.
So yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, you did a great job. Yeah, personally, sometimes when you read it, you can just tell that, you know, the author's like overcompensating or something. I definitely didn't get that when I was reading Black River, and so yeah, you did awesome, and yeah, very interesting to hear all that. I just wanted to let all of our audience know just real quickly. I've just got a couple more questions myself here, and then we'll move to the audience Q&A. So if you have any questions that you'd like answered, feel free to start popping those in the chat box for us. And so yeah, just thought I'd plug that real quick. And so yeah, kind of moving right along then. One more kind of Black River specific question that I had was, I think, yeah, a lot of times people are just curious, what was your favorite part of Black River? Like you had just mentioned that you actually gone back and read it again for this event. Did you find that there was a favorite part? And if you did, yeah, I think it'd be kind of interesting to hear if remembering back, were those parts harder to write because they were your favorite, or were they easier because of that?
Well, you know, I do think this is kind of a hard question. It's a good question. It was, you know, it was interesting reading it again. I mean, sometimes there's even just like a sentence where I would be like, yeah, that's what I was trying to do, man. That worked. So, you know, I am one of those writers. Like, I think, you know, I would like wake up while working on this book in the middle of the night and be like, I should be using a different verb on page 64. And, you know, that's kind of who I am. So I do get satisfaction sometimes when I even just see a sentence. But, you know, it's interesting to kind of think about favorite. You know, I was thinking about that while reading it. And, you know, there are certain scenes in the book that were kind of difficult to write in the sense of the subject matter, and I think probably difficult to read. But, you know, I worked really hard on them, and, you know, I'm glad to see when I read it that I think it has the impact I intended it to. So even though those would be maybe weird places to say they were my favorite, you know, maybe they're about some of the, you know, terrible things like Wes has experienced. I'm glad I was able to portray it in the way I had intended to. I also think, though, that if I had to choose maybe a favorite part, it might be the Claire chapters, the 4 chapters from Claire's point of view, Wes's wife. And part of that is just the way they came about. When I first was writing this book, I wrote about 100 pages of a first draft, and it was all Wes's point of view, you know, still third person, kind of like what's in the book. But I stopped after about 100 pages and I read it back and I was like, oh my goodness, like nobody is going to want to spend a whole book with this guy. You know, he's not a character who wants to spend, you know, really acknowledge his own feelings, let alone express them. That was a real challenge in writing about him. And, you know, he is rigid in many ways. You know, we see him make choices where I think most readers are like, you know, man, what are you doing? And I realized, like, oh man, this is going to be a problem. Like, you've got to find a way to show more of who this man is. And I had really kind of resisted as a writer doing books with multiple points of view, because as a reader, I find for myself, I mean, this is a generalization, but like I always want to like them and often feel frustrated. I feel like I get kind of moved to a new point of view, like when I don't want to, or I want to stay with a character. I find that, you know, for me, they're often not as satisfying as I want them to be. And so I was kind of struggling with this. I was like, oh, I really feel like it's Wes's story. What do I do? And then I had what now seems like, a very obvious sort of epiphany, which was, it's your novel. You set the rules. If you want another point of view, you don't have to give that person like equal page space to the other characters. You could have that character die in the first chapter. Sometimes when I did readings when this book first came out, everyone's faces would look shocked when I said something like that. And I would be like, it's not a spoiler. It happens like in the first 15 pages. It's okay. But I realized, ooh, I could have her sections go in like reverse chronological order. And so I really liked this idea, but they were very challenging to write. Each of them, I think, kind of functions almost as like a story within the book. I thought a lot about how I was going to structure them. They had to do a lot. They were, we get a lot of information about who Wes is, what his music meant to him, what the family was like before they left Black River, kind of what the riot meant to Wes, what actually happened during the riot. A lot of that information comes through those Claire chapters. So I was trying to make sure they did a lot of different things. And so those, I had to spend a lot of time revising them. I wrote a couple that never made it into the book. They just didn't work. So it was those, I don't have numbers, but my guess is I probably like per page spent a lot more time on those chapters than I did some of the rest of the book, which came more easily. But in rereading it, I'm pretty happy with how they turned out. So I think those might be some of my favorites just because they were a lot of work, but I feel satisfied with them.
Okay. Oh, interesting. Yeah. I personally thought the intro set things up, and yeah, were really great. And so, so you kind of just kind of touched on this just a little bit with some of your answers, just kind of the types of things that you'll read or look for. But so one question that I think a lot of people are always curious to hear about is if you count any other authors, either current or past, that you find to be influential in your own writing, or if like whether it's the style or even their subject matter, or if you have any that you appreciate or find influential in your own writing.
Yeah, I mean, I could name so many people, right? I do think for me, I've realized that maybe as a writer, I'm less likely to find specific, to cite specific authors as influences to me. It's more that I feel like when I read, if it's a book I admire, I look for what can I take away from it? What can I learn from it? And that means that I have a lot of influences, I think, that surprise people that don't necessarily seem like they would be related to what I do. So for a couple examples, I often talk about Gustave Flaubert and Madame Bovary, and people are like, really, that's interesting. And one of the reasons is actually that, kind of like I mentioned in my last answer, I was realizing like, oh man, readers are gonna have a hard time kind of connecting with this character. It seems like he could be what one of my grad school professors called like a dismissible character. And so I was so fascinated when I read Madame Bovary because, I mean, Bovary herself could be dismissible, but especially her husband, Charles. He's like he could have just been a doofus, like throughout the book, straight up. I mean, he's like, yes, beloved wife, totally go out on this carriage ride with this man that like literally everyone else knows you're having an affair with. So he could have just been kind of the clueless guy. And yet when I read it, I didn't feel like I could dismiss him. Flaubert went to such lengths to make sure that readers understood, his motivations were that he did love his wife. He did want the best for her. His moments of grief toward the end of the novel are really powerful, and maybe more powerful for coming from a character who could have been very easily written off as one-dimensional. There was something similar for me when I read Moby Dick with Starbuck, the first mate. He could have just been a foil for Ahab. He's kind of upstanding, he's a good guy, he's a Quaker. But there's, a wonderful chapter in that novel where he is considering murdering Ahab. And he's just going through this like incredibly difficult, angsty time all by himself as he tries to like weigh his religious faith and what he knows about being, a good whaleman, and knowing that his captain is basically insane. And I was just so impressed because he doesn't end up being, he's not like the one or two main characters people tend to think of when they think about Moby Dick. But I was just so enthralled kind of with how, even with a fairly minor character, Melville made him really complex. Other people, you know, I talked about stoic characters earlier. How do I handle characters? You know, I like writing sort of these, to some extent, almost stereotypical kind of Western or rural characters who are a little bit, you know, they're taciturn and all of that. What do I do with that? You know, Kazuo Ishiguro's Remains of the Day was really helpful to me in looking at that. And the last one I'll mention, just as an example of how I do as a writer try to find something in everything, is just now, like the most recent books I read were Herman Wouk's The Winds of War and War and Remembrance, which I found really compelling, but a 2-volume, 2,000-page historical epic that spans, I think, like 5 continents and, you know, many, many years, does not on its surface have a whole lot in common with the kind of writing I do, which is, you know, tends to be very compressed in terms of length and span of time and even cast of characters. So you wouldn't think, you know, and I probably wouldn't have thought earlier in my life that there was much I could learn as a writer from these books, even though I liked them. But one of the things I was thinking about while reading them is that all of us, I think, who write, think about, you know, we always have to decide, what do I show on the page? What scenes do I put in this book? What do I tell my authors? I mean, what do I tell my readers via summary? What do I leave off the page entirely? Well, you know, in these books, Wouk, of course, he has to leave a lot off the page. He's got a lot going on. He's got a huge cast of character, a world war, all kinds of things going on. And I was kind of surprised at times with what he chose to leave off or what he chose to show us in scene. And so I know that the next time I sit down to write something, I'll be thinking about that. And I'll be thinking about, you know, what can I kind of learn from the types of choices he made? So that's sort of how I think about like influences for my writing and other authors, and what I try to learn from them as a writer.
Okay, oh, very, very interesting. So that's neat. Yeah, it's always interesting to hear authors talk about like what they like to read and what they are reading. It just kind of, yeah, just always interesting to hear, and if that plays any roles in their writing or not. So yeah, before we get to the audience Q&A, I just had one final question that I was going to ask, and basically it's just yeah, what's next for you? You just had your Eden Mind published. Are you working on anything new, or just kind of rolling with that? And so
yeah, you know, I mean, you know, I kind of alluded to this earlier. It's, as you can guess, I mean, it's 2020, right? It was a weird time to have a book come out. It was published in February, but because of my teaching schedule at the university where I teach, my book tour started on March 10th. And ended very abruptly on March 12th. I remember being, I think on the night of, I think it was the night of the 11th, you know, I'd done an event and I'd gone to just like a restaurant that had, you know, always had like the sports TV screens on and everything. So I was sitting there eating my, you know, not very inspiring dinner. And it was the night that the NBA had rather abruptly, like, you know, canceled the you know, season. And I was like, looking at all of these TV screens with all of these like ESPN reporters standing in the middle of empty arenas. And I was like, this is not good. So, you know, doing virtual events like this has been great, but I think that adjustment, like I usually start something like right away. And I haven't totally started my next project yet, which surprises me a little, but I do know what it's going to be. I do think I have, you know, kind of maybe at least one more Montana novel in me, kind of in this same fictionalized setting of Western Montana that I've created. And I think I'd like it to be based on or maybe influenced by a short story that I wrote. I was thinking about this earlier today, and I wrote it like, I think about 10 years ago, which makes me feel very old. But it's about a woman whose husband is a, you know, very up and coming politician on the national level. And then he suffers a kind of career ending brain injury. So it's again, kind of revisiting some of these questions of you know, marriage and you know, how people kind of shape their identity and loyalty and a lot of these things that I'm very interested in. So I think that will probably be what comes next.
Okay. Oh, very, very neat. Yeah, probably speaking for more than myself, but I'll be looking out for that one then. And so, so yeah, well, thank you very much for answering these questions and sitting and talking with me. Yeah, that was awesome. So thank you very much. So yeah, that wraps up what I had. And so I'll turn it over to Greta to conduct the audience Q&A. And just, yeah, thank you again very much. And yeah, we'll get to those audience questions now.
All right. Well, we've had some good ones. Both Jenny and Joel are asked about the prison riots. Joel mentioned that he wondered if the portrayal was difficult to write given how intense the riot scenes are. And both Jenny and Joel were wondering what type of research you did to learn about prisons, riots, work of correction officers, if you interviewed anyone, anything behind that.
Yeah, so I'll kind of tackle that research part first. And, you know, I really enjoy doing research, and I did a lot of different kinds of research for Black River, and specifically for the kind of prison aspects. You know, fortunately don't have a lot of, you know, first person experience. So it was something I had to do a lot of research on. And some of that is just, you know, reading books. When I was in grad school, the university library at the University of Oregon had one book that was nothing but basically like transcriptions of interviews with prison employees who had been involved in like hostage situations. And it had some very like sensationalist title or something. And, you know, I essentially checked it out for like 3 years straight while I was working on this book. And all I could think was just like, you know, the librarians at this library must really wonder about me. But, you know, things like that were useful because in a sense that was almost like a secondhand interview because they were essentially these transcriptions. I actually have found for myself that for things like this, the internet has been really great. I do interview people sometimes, individuals, but, you know, then as valuable as that can be, you're limited to that one person's experience. And when I am trying to kind of create a character, create a situation, I've found that places like message boards and things like that have been really useful to me. So I did spend some time reading like message boards for people who work in prisons. And that was valuable because I got to hear, you know, I mean, obviously it's anonymous and it's the internet, so you kind of take things with a grain of salt, but there's such a sheer volume of it that, you know, you get to hear of people in very different roles, in very different kinds of facilities, in very different places around the country, who had very different attitudes toward their jobs. And just having all of that kind of information gave me a lot to kind of play with when I was creating my characters. One of the things that was most useful was visiting the old Montana prison in Deer Lodge. So Black River is very much fictionalized. It is not Deer Lodge. It's much smaller for one thing, geographically different. I had wanted in the book it to be, you know, very much kind of like a company town, if you will. And yet I did borrow some things. So one of the things I borrowed is this old Gothic looking prison that is like directly downtown, and a newer campus that is outside of the city. That's something they do have in Deer Lodge. So I did go to the prison a couple times, and it's great because they basically like, you know, I mean, I think they will do tours, but if you just go on random days, they're kind of like, here's your pamphlet, go walk around, which as a writer was fantastic. There was basically no one else there when I was there. I could walk through and just really imagine my characters in this setting. You can go inside, you know, the old cell block. When I went, you know, there were all these like doves cooing and everything. And I mean, it was very, you know, atmospheric in a way that as an author, I got very excited about. And so that was really, you know, fantastic. I do remember though, you know, I'd taken a couple pictures and I went with my father once and he took a picture of me in this cell block. And then that's the photo that my like high school alumni magazine chose to run when they wrote about like, here's our alumni who has a book, and it was huge. And I was like, oh great, everyone I went to high school with is not going to read the text and it's just going to be like, oh look, Sarah went to prison. So that was not my you know, favorite photo of all time, but it was really helpful to me to have this combination of kind of traditional research, book research, you know, interviews and transcriptions of interviews, combined with being able to actually go walk around a setting that was very much like the setting I was hoping for. I did change things though. There were incidents at the prison in Montana. I did borrow some things from a riot that took place there in the 1950s. But it's very different in part because I really needed it to be in 1992. And I really needed certain details to happen in certain ways that they did not in real life. So that's part of why I chose to fictionalize things. In terms of, was it difficult to write? Yeah. I mean, I would sort of start feeling a little anxious a few days before I got to some of those places when I was drafting, because not just because it was difficult subject matter, but like I knew I really had to get it right. And that was something I really spent a lot of time on in revision. I wrote a lot more than actually made it into the book. It's very, I think, blooming in the book, and I think the effect, based on talking to readers, is that it feels like there's a lot more of it actually on the page than really is. I cut a lot out. A lot of what we do get is in pretty short snippets. It'll be a paragraph here, a paragraph there, and there are then like a couple scenes where Wes is really thinking about what happened in detail. And that was like paring down a lot and figuring out, where can I find these particular images or these particular things William says, or the specific thing that will stick in readers' minds. And I think that ended up actually being kind of more powerful and more impactful than when I had the longer descriptions in the drafts.
That's impressive, I guess. And as a librarian at a college library, I love it if people have a book for 2-3 years. I know they're using it and I get excited. So don't feel bad. Don't feel bad about that. So we read your book for book club, and before tonight, I reviewed my notes. I always send a recap from our book club, and I wrote this in my recap. I found this to be one of the best discussions we've had, and we talked at length about the different layers in the story and the big questions the author raises. So that's pretty, I mean, we had just such a good discussion about this book. And I was curious about what other types of reactions you've had from book clubs as you've joined things like this.
Yeah, I mean, it's been great to visit book clubs, and if there is sort of maybe a silver lining, I guess, to the pandemic, I mean, I hesitate to even phrase it that way. It's that it has, given me the opportunity to do a few more things virtually and maybe interact with some groups that I probably wouldn't have been able to do in person. And it's really kind of run the gamut, right? I mean, it's interesting to hear people's reactions. I do sometimes run into people who have strong feelings and not necessarily positive ones, which I'm okay with. Part of me as a writer is like, yay, got a reaction. But it'll be interesting. I have people who get very angry when the characters make bad decisions, even though I think it would be a dull book if they sometimes did not. But it is interesting. I mean, we talked earlier, Matt had the question about faith, and I do think that people are interested in talking about that. It kind of reinforces my belief that it's not a big part of a lot of books that a lot of people are reading. It's, writing about it is a good way to get compared to like Marilyn Robinson in reviews, because that's, who everyone thinks of, which is wonderful. And I love her writing. But the fact that it's so often one author, who's very prominent, tells me that there is more desire, I think, for books that engage with that and can talk about that issue. The music is something people talk about, because even people who are not themselves musicians, I've found that a lot of people have something in their life that makes them feel the way music makes Wes feel. And being able to kind of hear from people, like, what is that thing in your life? What is the thing that you love that is maybe not something you make money out of? Maybe it's not practical, but it's something that is very, very meaningful, and it's a big part of who you are. I've really enjoyed getting to sort of hear people talk about that.
That's great. Another question, kind of speaking about that, people having strong reactions to things. Someone submitted a question saying that Scott's death was so heartbreaking and disappointing. Our book club wanted that do-over of mentoring in music, which failed with Dennis, to succeed with Scott. So we're wondering, or this person's wondering, why you chose to have him, like Wes's dad, commit suicide.
Yes, that is the thing I have made the most readers angry with. Absolutely. And, I mean, it's something I wrestled with as an author too, right? Even as a writer, I mean, I love my characters, I know so much about my characters that don't even make it into the books. And it was a challenging decision, but I think for me, I did want to resist a little bit the idea, that we do see in other kinds of books, including kinds of books that I love, which is sort of the, art as cure-all, or even mentorship as cure-all. I really did want to resist that a little bit in the story, partly because I think it is, from sort of a narrative standpoint, it's a point in the book where everything is falling apart for Wes. And it really, kind of has to, I think, for the end of it to have the impact I was hoping it would have. But I also wanted to explore the idea that, like, even when things don't work out, that doesn't mean that the time spent on them was valueless. I don't think that because Scott's story ended in tragedy, that the time Dennis and Wes spent with him was wasted. I certainly think that Scott's time with music and with Wes teaching him music meant something to him, and did make his time in Black River, as difficult as it was, better. And so I think I like some of those aspects of the story. It's always interesting, I do have people read the books and say, oh my goodness, your writing is so dark. But I hope that most people at the end see that there is, I hope there is some hope as well. I do try and write with looking at, what can forgiveness offer? What are possibilities for redemption? But not every single character gets that in the book. And so some of those decisions are about who's in charge, who's sort of the book about.
Okay, speaking about a little bit more about your process, we had another couple questions about that. Someone was curious if you knew how the book would end when you began it. And someone else was curious about when you reread it and when you reread it recently, did you find things you still wanted to revise? This person feels like when she writes, it just never feels finished.
So I think, just to kind of tackle that second one, not too much. This is going to make me sound unspeakably fussy, but like the one thing I noticed while rereading it this week is there is the word that in a sentence that I really wish I could take it out because it's very unnecessary. And I was trained very, very firmly in grad school to like remove all unnecessary uses of that. And I found one, I was like, no. I sort of, try not to even think about that once it's published. For me, when the book is published, it's published. I'm very, 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 very fussy with it before it's published. I really do look at every word. I think a lot about syntax. I look at things on a sentence level very carefully. I'm very much a perfectionist, which has its, pros and cons. And so kind of the final stages of editing are really difficult for me. I mean, I think I'm good at it, but it's stressful. I do want to make it right. And with Black River, I do remember reading the final page proofs, and it was like very late. I had to send them back the next day. And I like called my mother in tears being like, this book is horrible. I can't publish it. It will be an embarrassment to have it in the world with my name on it. And I like go through this whole like meltdown. And my mother was basically like, Sarah, the book is good. You need to send it back to your editor and then you should go to bed. And I, thank goodness, like took my mother's advice. I did listen to my mother. And I felt, much better about it than, reading it just now. But I do think that's natural. I mean, I think there's warring tendencies for any writer. You want it to be the best it can be. You don't want to settle for good enough if you're aiming for great. But at the same time, you can't tinker with it forever or it will never be a finished product. And I think that's something all writers kind of deal with. But I think when you get to the stage where you are looking at things on that sentence level, you're genuinely torn between, do I do this? Do I do that? That's probably a hint that you're pretty close to where you need to be. And I think it's hard, when something is in your head, it's just has so much possibility. And when you make those choices and you're making choices over and over and over and over as a writer, you're pinning things down. I think in one of her essays, Ann Patchett kind of compares this to when your story is an idea. It's like a butterfly flying around. It's so amazing. And when you've written the book, it's kind of like a butterfly, like pinned to a display, and it might still be beautiful, but it is not quite the same. And sometimes I tell my writing students this, and about half of them look at me like that's a horrifying analogy and I never want to think about my writing this way. But I actually found it sort of reassuring. I think that feeling is normal, that the idea that maybe there was possibility there that you didn't quite capture on the page is just built into the process. It's something none of us avoid. And I'm going to have to ask you to remind me of the first part of the question. The
first question is if you knew how it would end, if you knew how the book would end when you began it.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I have found now, having written 2 books, that I've done the same thing with both books, and it works really well for me, which is that I do a lot of planning. I really think about my book structurally, more so I think than some people do. I really start from that before I even begin drafting. But what I find is that I like to have things planned pretty carefully to a decision point for my main character toward the end. So in Black River, I knew there would be a scene where Wes and Williams confronted one another outside of the prison. But I didn't know exactly when I started writing what would happen at that confrontation. But by the time, I said earlier, I write chronologically. By the time I got there when drafting, I knew Wes and his journey well enough that I knew what he would do. And I didn't really have to consider other endings. And that kind of held true for me with my second book too. So for me, I think I need that structure of most of the novel to keep me from just sort of like, I already write long drafts, and I think if I didn't go into it with that degree of planning, that I would probably be like Michael Douglas's character in Wonder Boys, who writes like a 4,000-page manuscript that still isn't done and maybe never will be. That would probably be me. So I try and strike that balance for myself of planning where I have a lot of the key scenes and the key points planned out, but I leave room for a little bit of surprise for myself as the writer at the end.
Nice. Then we had one more question about writing, and this is from Lisa Johnson, who is also a librarian in Sioux County, and she says this is National Novel Writing Month, where writers' goals are to pen 50,000 words. Do you have any suggestions for new writers or those taking part in the challenge? And do you find that deadlines help? And they also were curious if you had any writing excuses that keep you from sitting down to do the work.
I think for myself, and something I tell my students, is just that I think it's important to finish drafts. I have so many students who kind of reach a point where they get stuck on something, and so they start a new project, because most of us usually have other ideas for things we want to write. And I think that's okay to a point, but I think you need to be committed to going back and finishing that first thing, unless you've just decided you're no longer interested in it. And I think my view on that probably does come from the fact that I feel like most of what I hope makes my writing successful comes in revision, but you can't revise a draft you don't have. So I am kind of in the camp of like, it is useful, I think, to just finish something and then have it, even if it's a kind of a mess. It gives you something to work with. And I do also like to say that, to go back and reference Melville again, sometimes people point out strange, this character never appears again. And I'm like, well, he did write like a 600-page novel, presumably by like quill pen and whale oil lamp. So happily, we have computers. So once you've got that draft, we have no excuses, right? We can always go back to the previous version if we try something that doesn't work. So that's something I do like. And I think that's something like the National Novel Writing Month can be good to just encourage people to generate material. I think there's a way in which that can be a problem. If you just feel like it's absolutely not working, continuing to produce more of that maybe isn't great. But that tendency to want to edit to perfection in the first draft, I think, is a problem for most people. So I do think that kind of the deadline thing, that just varies so much, right? In terms of how helpful it is to people. I have never tried to do anything with like the National Novel Writing Month, because I just don't think it would work for me. I've never been a writer who writes every single day. But I also don't think it works if you are trying to do it professionally or seriously to just be like, I will wait for inspiration, because sometimes that does not happen for a very, very, very long time. I had an interesting experience with my first 2 books. When we went to sell Black River, my agent sent it out to various editors, and, pretty shortly thereafter, he was like, hey, this editor at Houghton Mifflin Harcourt wants to talk to you on the phone, which I think is, typical before they decide whether to buy your book or not. I was, of course, very nervous, and the conversation was going well. And then she said something like, well, what are you working on next? And I was utterly unprepared for this question, which I should not have been. And so I kind of muttered something about a short story I'd been working on that maybe was a novel, and we moved on. And then like the next day my agent calls and was like, great news, they want to buy Black River and also the other novel you pitched. And I was like, is that what I did? It is, and that's the one that was just published in February. So I had this experience of, you know, like most people, my first novel, of course, I had all the time I needed to write it. I had all the time I needed to think about it before I started writing it. You know, no one in the world is usually waiting for your first novel. But then the second one had a deadline. So my experience with that was a little different. You know, the first draft was like a lot messier. And, you know, I did a lot more revision with my editor for my second book than I did with the first one. I think mostly because she saw it so much sooner in the process. By the time she saw Black River, it was pretty much done. She saw Eden Mine at a much earlier stage. And the deadline thing was, I mean, it was useful in that I certainly got it done, but it was stressful at times. You know, there were points I had sort of started a new career. I'd moved several times while trying to write it. You know, life was happening. And, you know, I mean, I'm glad in the sense that I got it done. I don't know if I would have gotten it done as quickly without the deadline, but I probably would have had more fun writing it without it.
Okay.
So there was that. The excuse thing, just real quickly, I don't know if I do the excuses so much, but I do just get busy with other things. I find that, you know, if I want my writing to be a priority, like everything else in the world, you have to make time for it. You have to decide that it's more important than other things. You know, I don't have like any streaming services or anything like that. I mean, I have a DVD player and I watch a lot of DVDs and stuff, but I think just having that temptation removed is something that for me is important. Other people that probably wouldn't work for, they might need that to unwind or relax before they can get into a writing mindset. So I think it's just kind of finding the thing that you find yourself saying, maybe tomorrow, and then deciding, is it a thing that you're comfortable cutting out?
Good advice there. The final question I have, and we've kind of talked a little bit about reactions to the book, but I kind of missed this earlier in the chat. But someone was wondering if you had a different reaction from readers from different parts of the country. You talk about this, you know, fictional area in Western Montana. Do people on the East or in real urban areas connect with your setting?
Yeah, I mean, that's been really interesting. And I think to lead into that question, you know, I was a little surprised when my first book came out, Black River, to the degree to which it was kind of promoted as like Western fiction. I, as someone who grew up in the West and has almost always lived in the West, I sort of thought of it more of like just writing about the people and places that I know best. And I remember once seeing a photo from a library somewhere and they'd put like a little cowboy boot sticker on the spine. And I was like, really? Which, you know, I mean, I'm not like, you know, I like Westerns. I mean, I mentioned those DVDs earlier. I'm working my way through the entire series of Rawhide right now. You know, I can enjoy my, you know, cowboys and all of that. But it's not really what I do. And so that surprised me, and I was kind of uncomfortable with it at first, but I've since sort of embraced the regional writer label. You know, I do think it helps me find readers both in the West and outside of it. I do find that, you know, when I'm in Montana, I've sometimes had Montanans be very annoyed with me for like, you know, moving mountain ranges. They're like, that's not where that mountain range is. I said, yeah, but it's not, like, it has its own name. It's not that mountain range. And they're like, but I know it's supposed to be. And I said, well, but it's not. So there's a little bit of the, like, they kind of, you know, or people will say, well, this is not what Deer Lodge is like. I'm like, that's why the book is not called Deer Lodge. So I definitely hide behind that, like, it's fictionalized thing as an author. But I do think that, you know, it is meaningful to me when someone from Montana says, you know, I feel like you got this right. You know, this feels like my state. This feels like my home. At the same time, it's interesting to see what perceptions of that part of the country are from elsewhere. You know, I've had people who live elsewhere in the country, maybe on the East Coast or something like that, say they chose to read it because they love reading books about that part of the country. And that's interesting to me because as a writer, I do think a lot about the degree to which I am kind of playing myself with those ideas about the mythologies or stories of the West. To what degree do I know that if you write a book about Montana, there will be people who are like, ooh, Montana, that's kind of, you know, romantic and dramatic. I'll read that. I think in my work, I say I love writing, gushy descriptions of mountains. I will probably never write anything where I don't get to write at least one like nice lyrical description of a mountain range. But I also like to show the other side of it, the prison town, the mining town, the community that is right next to the freeway where people have a bunch of stuff dumped in their yard. I'm kind of enjoy that, and I sometimes wonder how much those aspects of things play into how people react too. I think people who live in those kinds of communities, whether they're in the West or not, appreciate seeing that portrayed on the page. I wonder sometimes if it surprises people thinking it was going to be all pretty mountain ranges. But I like having the tension between those things in one book.
Nice. Well, thank you so much for being patient with our questions, and
I love
excuse me,
questions.
and answering them so thoroughly. I don't know what happened to my voice there, but I'm gonna transition to another member of our committee now, Nicole, and she is gonna reveal our book for next year. So I'm excited to see how people react to that. Nicole, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Well, as Greta said, I am Nicole McCrae, director at the Rock Valley Public Library and a committee member of One Book, One Sioux County. And thank you again, Sarah, for everything that you shared with us tonight. I always find myself after these, during obviously, and after these events, wanting to like research more about the authors of the books that I'm currently reading, because I just love hearing all these details. So that just means a lot that you are willing to share with us. So thanks again. All right, so as you all know, each year we make a book selection for the members of Sioux County to read and come together and discuss, and then have the opportunity to meet and hear from the author at our annual event, which hopefully we will be able to hold in person next year. But I guess I should get on with what next year's read is. So the One Book, One Sioux County book selection for 2021 is The Line Between by Tosca Lee. And as just a quick teaser, I'm going to read you a brief synopsis of the book. All right, so here we go. An extinct disease reemerges from the melting Alaskan permafrost to cause madness in its victims. For recent apocalyptic cult escapee Winter Roth, it's the end she'd always been told was coming. When Winter Roth is turned out of New Earth, a self-contained doomsday cult on the American prairie, she emerges into a world poised on the brink of madness as a mysterious outbreak of rapid early onset dementia spreads across the nation. As Winter struggles to start over in a world she's been taught to regard as evil, she finds herself face to face with the apocalypse she's feared all her life, until the night her sister shows up at her doorstep with a set of medical samples. That night, Winter learns there's something far more sinister at play, and that these samples are key to understanding the disease. So if that hasn't already captured your interest, I would just highly recommend it. I have to admit, when I first read the synopsis, when we were looking through what our choices were, I was thinking that it wasn't exactly my kind of book. But then when I started reading it, I finished it in like a day, and it was so good. So I have recommended it to a few patrons at our library, and it's been checked out pretty much all the time. I also should let you know that there is a sequel. So if you enjoy it, then I hope that you can check out the sequel too. And we also just wanted to clarify that if it's crossed your mind that this choice may reflect some of our current world pandemic, well, we did make this selection long before that. So it's not like we made a choice to have this pandemic novel to go along with COVID-19. And then a little bit to share about Tosca Lee. She is the author of this book, and she is a New York Times bestselling author and is also known for her work with Ted Dekker. She currently resides in the Midwest with her husband and children and will be joining us a year from now. So we hope that you enjoy this read. And now we're going to do some book giveaways. We'll be giving away some copies of Tosca Lee's The Line Between for 2021's One Book, One Sioux County. And then also some copies of, I think, a copy of Black River, since we're doing some giveaways also at our watch parties. And then also Sarah Hulse's latest, Eden Mine. So I'm going to let Greta do those drawings.
All right, did you guys all see a spinning wheel? Oh no, I hope so.
Yes,
Anyway, I'm gonna spin, and if you can, when if your name is drawn, if you can just put in the chat which library you're a part of, then that'll help us make sure you get the right book. We will send them to you through courier. Sarah Hulse was nice enough to sign a bunch of copies. So the first thing I'm going to draw for here is a signed copy of Black River. So here we go. All right. Amy Jurens, this is for you. So you can go ahead and put your name in the chat and your library. And now I will draw for a signed copy of Eden Mine. All right, that's for Amanda. Well, I'm not sure if she's here or not, so we will see. All right, we'll go again. All right, Kim Starkenberg, that's a copy of Eden Mine as well. So indicate your library in the chat, please. All right, Eldora Vanderbrink. And that was our last copy of Eden Mine. So now we're going to draw for 3 copies of next year's book, which is The Line Between by Tosca Lee. All right, Patricia, I'm pretty sure you're here if I remember seeing the names right. So we will make sure you get that. Oh, good. Jim, that's for you, a signed copy, or not a signed copy, just a copy of Tosca Lee's book. And we have one more of those. Here I go. All right, Sydney. Now, someone told me that Amanda, who was drawn for Eden Mine, isn't here. So I'm going to go ahead and draw that one more time. Here we go. Oh, I'm pretty sure I saw James in the group tonight. So James, that's a copy of Eden Mine for you, signed by our guest tonight. So that's great. If we've called your name, please let us know your local library, and we will make sure to get the book to you through Iowa's great courier service that we now have. All right, and then I think I'll just send this back to Matt to close us out for the night.
So, all right. Thank you. That about wraps us up for tonight. Congratulations to all of our prize winners. I'm actually jealous. So I hope you enjoy those books that you have. Yeah, again, just let us know your library and we'll get those to you. We're very excited. Yeah, like Nicole had said. Yeah, we're very excited that for next, if I could speak, next year's book, and hope that you are as well. Just a huge thank you to you, Sarah, for joining us tonight. Yeah, it's a bit of a bummer that we couldn't do it in person like we originally scheduled, but very awesome that you joined us virtually tonight. And so thank you very much for that. Yeah, I just thought I'd also say thanks to all of the libraries and librarians who we all collaborate to make this event each year. There's a lot of time and effort and energy and talents and ideas that are put into this from all of our county libraries. And it's just really great how we can all work together. And so, yeah, lastly, I just want to say thank you to all of you who attended tonight. Yeah, you're the reason that we've been doing this event. We're excited for next year. We're glad that you joined us this year. I guess, yeah, fingers crossed that next year we can be in person again. But like tonight shows, if not, we can sure virtual works too. So yeah, if I'll just wrap this up and say, if you haven't read Sarah's next book, Eat in Mind, check it out from your local library. Check out your favorite bookseller. But yeah, if you liked Black River, I'd say go give that one a look. And so thank you again to everyone. And yeah, I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your evening. Thanks for joining us.